In this lesson, we're going to talk a little bit more about the nature of socialism specifically, and talk about the ways in which different socialist thinkers believe the best outcome is resolved in terms of creating a socialist state. And so naturally what we're going to be talking about is how we're going to ever arrive at a state of socialism according to these different thinkers. So this is actually one of the most important and most egregious disagreements within different socialist thinkers, whether or not it can be achieved through revolution or through reform. Now, for the most part, people agree that we could achieve, if we had a revolution, we could achieve a state of socialism. But the question that is important to ask is not necessarily whether or not we can achieve socialism through revolution, but whether or not we should achieve socialism through revolution, and instead whether we should opt for a slower, more methodological process which leads to slow reform into a socialist state. And this is really the distinction between what we call revolutionary socialism and evolutionary socialism. So again, revolutionary socialism is, as the name suggests, socialism through a kind of revolutionary means, and then evolutionary socialism, as the name suggests, is one which is more to deal with issues relating to slow reform and minor reforms as we go along. So let's begin by talking about revolutionary socialism. And revolutionary socialism is the original Marxist conception of socialism. Okay, it is a revolutionary idea. Okay, and Marx and Engels argued that socialism can only and will only be achieved through revolutionary means. Okay, now they argued that from a historical materialist perspective, that socialism will be something that naturally takes place. Okay, it's, an achievement and a transition into socialism will naturally happen, but it's just that the method in which we're going to achieve that is through revolution. And the idea is to have a worker revolution, so a bottom-up revolution, where the proletariat sees the means of production, and we enter into a transitionary state into socialism, and then eventually into communism, etc., etc., etc. And revolution will come as a result of both worker alienation and this growing class consciousness that results from worker alienation. So don't forget, we know what worker alienation refers to, the idea that the worker is unable to enjoy the fruits of their own labour because they are effectively, from a Marxist perspective, exploited for their labour profit and their labour value, and this creates a growing class consciousness. The working class, the proletariat, begin to become consciously aware of their situation, of their predicament, of their alienated state, and they will then, workers will then rise up and seize the means of production and enter into this transitionary period. And this will ultimately replace any kind of liberal democracy with a, quote, dictatorship of the proletariat. And again, I shouldn't be stressing this more, that when we talk of the word dictatorship from a Marxist perspective, doesn't necessarily refer to the kind of dictatorships that we're thinking about today. So, things like, China or Nazi Germany, for example. Dictatorship from a Marxist perspective in Marx's day simply referred to the dominant control, the 100% control. And I guess to an extent that's what dictatorship refers to today. However, we have a bit more political connotations with the word. The philosopher and political activist Rosa Luxemburg also argued that socialism cannot be achieved through the working of the state. So this is again another conception of the revolutionary idea of socialism, that it shouldn't be done through the working of the state. It should be done as a way to overthrow the state, as it were, in a revolutionary way, and to eventually lead to a situation where the state would wither away, which is a quote from Marx himself. And on the other hand, we have evolutionary socialism. One good example of an evolutionary socialist was the political activist and theorist Beatrice Webb. Now, they believed that there was a concept known as the inevitability of gradualism. Now, the inevitability of gradualism simply states that it's the idea that political democracy will eventually lead to the transition into a state of socialism, that we don't need revolution, okay, that there is no no need for revolution, okay, for revolution, because the state of political progression and the inevitability of gradualism will eventually lead to a situation where we have a socialist state, okay? And this is what a number of socialists today would argue, okay? There are not too many mainstream socialist thinkers that would be advocating for and pushing for a global revolution, for example. They believe in a transitionary period. And it is the position that socialism can be achieved using not overthrowing the state, but also using legislative and parliamentary reform. So they believe that through different pieces of legislation, that we can get to a situation where socialism takes place. Now, from a practical policy perspective, a number of socialists today would argue in things such as worker cooperatives, which is the idea of, instead of having a business structure that relies on the ownership of a select handful of people, the shareholders of a company, for example, that the company itself is in the hands of every single worker that works there. And there are arguments for the idea of what they call worker democracy. And this is known as worker democracy. Worker democracy. Now, ultimately, there are pros and cons from different perspectives as to the efficacy of worker co-ops and whether or not this should be something that just naturally takes place or it should be state enforced. But this is an example of a political, policy prescription that can be utilized to achieve a more apt socialist state. Now, of course, one reform won't equal socialism. I don't think anybody would be arguing that. However, a number of different reforms, like the idea of enforcing worker cooperatives and different things such as electoral reform, criminal justice reform, etc., etc., would eventually lead to a state whereby the workers own the means of production. One key example of how this can be achieved is also through the use of and the introduction of universal suffrage. And the concept of universal suffrage is simply the allowing people to vote. So the universal right to vote. Let's just write that down here. So universal suffrage is simply the universal right to vote. Universal right to vote. So, of course, there have been many, many, many political battles that have taken place in terms of the right to vote. So first it was women getting the right to vote, and then it was racial minorities being allowed to have the right to vote. A very key example is in the United States in the 1960s. So all of these things have led to an increase of universal suffrage. Now, there are still areas within society that some socialists would argue people within society that socialists would argue do not have the right to vote. One good example is prisoners, and some of them may argue that they should be allowed to have the right to vote, that the act of going to prison or the act of being convicted for a crime does not automatically take away your right to vote. Anyway, so this is where the introduction of universal suffrage takes place. And the reason why the introduction of universal suffrage can lead to this evolutionary form of socialism is that it allows everyone to vote, and therefore allows the voices of the working class to be heard. If everybody has the right to vote and to vote in different elections and different referenda, for example, then this grants the voices of the working class, and it creates an environment whereby the working class voice should be heard. And also through things such as education reform and gradual legislative reform, we can achieve socialism within the context of the current state that exists. So this is ultimately one of the key differences between these two forms of achieving socialism. One is through almost the setting aside of the state, almost, eliminating the state to an extent and just letting the state wither away as we go from a transition into a communist state. However, on this side, we think that the current state can exist, and we can have legislative and parliamentary reform, and we can also achieve socialism through that way as well.